She bought a cabin for $1, but when she opened the door, she found a giant mountain man living inside. The wind howls through the pines, the church bell tolls in the valley, and the widow's hands tremble as the rifle lifts toward her. He isn't just a hermit. He's a man with a past carved in blood and betrayal, a man the town fears, and the railroad wants gone. She only wanted a home, but what she found was a fight for survival, for dignity, and maybe, just maybe, for something more. When the sheriff's keys clang and the jail door slams, when the railroad agent waves papers that can burn her dream to ash, and when an old woman steps forward with a secret carved in wood, everything she thought she knew will be tested. The snow is falling, the fire is dying, the cabin is all they have left. Can a widow's faith and a mountain man's strength stand against the power of the railroad? Or will they both be buried under the weight of the past? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Emily Hensley sat quietly in the back row of the Silverton courthouse, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. The wooden bench creaked beneath her as she shifted her weight, trying to still her trembling nerves. All around her, the room buzzed with the low murmur of ranchers and land speculators, their boots scuffing against the plank floor as they waited for the auction to begin. The courthouse smelled of dust and leather, tobacco and sweat. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows, catching motes of dust that danced in the air. Emily pulled her plain brown shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling out of place among the crowd of mostly men in their good suits and polished boots. At the front of the room, the auctioneer cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. He was a thin man with a surprisingly booming voice that filled every corner of the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin with the Miller property on Pine Street." Emily watched as prime lots and buildings were snapped up by wealthy buyers. Each crack of the gavel made her flinch slightly. She'd saved every penny she could from her seamstress work, but her purse held precious little. Still, she kept her spine straight and her eyes forward, even as she felt the sideways glances from others in the room. The sun had shifted noticeably when the auctioneer finally held up a worn slip of paper. "Next item, the old Jensen cabin, 3 miles up Mountainside Trail. Property includes structure and surrounding 2 acres. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Emily had heard about the cabin. Everyone had. It was too far from town, too difficult to reach, and too run down to be worth anything. She watched as the wealthy men who'd been bidding all afternoon suddenly found great interest in their boot tips or the ceiling beams. "Opening bid at $5, the auctioneer called out. The room remained silent, except for a few poorly concealed snickers. $3? He tried again. More silence. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she slowly raised her hand. $1, she said, her voice quiet but clear. The laughter that burst forth was immediate and cruel. Emily felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her chin up, refusing to look away from the auctioneer. $1 bid, he announced, scanning the room with raised eyebrows. Do I hear $1.25? The silence that followed was different now, thick with mockery rather than disinterest. Emily could hear women whispering behind their hands, their words carrying clearly in the quiet room. Poor thing must be desperate indeed. Widow Hensley's finally lost her mind. Going to live like a hermit up there, I suppose. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to Mrs. Emily Hensley for $1. Emily rose on shaky legs and made her way to the front of the room. Each step felt longer than the last as boots and skirts shifted aside to let her pass. She could feel every eye in the room following her progress. At the auctioneer's desk, she carefully counted out 4 quarters from her coin purse. The metal felt warm in her palm as she laid them down one by one. The deed he handed her in return was creased and yellowed. But to Emily it represented something precious, a chance at a new beginning. She tucked the paper carefully into her pocket and turned to leave. The crowd parted before her, some faces wearing looks of pity, others barely concealing their amusement. Emily kept her eyes forward, her steps measured and dignified. Just before she reached the door, she heard Mrs. Bradford, one of her regular sewing clients, stage whisper to her companion, "Mark my words, she'll be back in town within the week, tail between her legs." Emily pushed open the heavy courthouse door and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. Only then did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly as she leaned against the building's stone wall. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, you know my heart in this. Please bless this risk I'm taking. Help me find the strength to build something worthwhile, even if others can't see it yet." The walk home to her rented room above the general store was long enough for doubt to creep in around the edges of her resolve. But every time she touched the deed in her pocket, she felt a small surge of determination. This was her chance to build something of her own, to create a home where she could live out her days with dignity rather than depending on the charity of others as she aged. That evening, Emily packed methodically by lamplight. Into her carpet bag went the essentials: her worn Bible, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth, her sewing kit with needles, threads, and scissors, a loaf of bread and some dried apples, a change of clothes. She set aside her sturdiest shoes for the morning's hike. The small room felt close and airless as she lay in her narrow bed that night. Sleep proved elusive as her mind raced with all the tasks ahead, assessing the cabin's condition, making repairs, finding a way to haul supplies up the mountain trail. She knew the whole town would be watching, waiting for her to fail. "I reckon they'll be mighty surprised," she whispered to herself in the darkness, allowing a small smile to cross her face. She might be a widow of 52 years, but she was far from helpless. The same hands that could create delicate embroidery could learn to wield a hammer. The arms that carried loads of washing could surely manage firewood. Still, as she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were uneasy, filled with steep mountain paths that seemed to go on forever and cabin doors that wouldn't quite open no matter how hard she pushed. She woke several times in the night, each time reaching to touch the deed on her bedside table, reassuring herself that it was real. As she lay there in the pre-dawn darkness, Emily thought of her late husband Thomas, gone these 10 years in the mine collapse that had taken so many of Silverton's men. He had always encouraged her to be bold, to trust in God's guidance. She could almost hear his voice. "You've got more grit than the whole town put together, Em. Don't you let them tell you different." Dawn would come soon enough, bringing with it the start of her new life. Emily closed her eyes once more, her hand still resting on the deed, and prayed for the strength to face whatever challenges the mountain might hold. The first pale light of dawn painted the eastern sky as Emily stepped onto the muddy street. Spring thaw had turned the ground treacherous, and her shoes were soon caked with wet earth. She adjusted the carpet bag in her grip and straightened her shawl against the morning chill. A hay wagon creaked past, drawn by 2 heavy draft horses. The driver, old Mr. Peterson, pulled his team to a stop when he saw her. "Mornin', Ms. Hensley. Heard tell you bought yourself some property up mountain way." "Yes, sir, I did." Emily lifted her chin slightly, ready for more mockery. Instead, the weathered farmer just nodded. "Well, I'm headed toward the foothills. Could give you a ride part way, if you're of a mind." "Much obliged," Emily said softly, accepting his help to climb onto the wooden seat. The wagon swayed and jolted as they left town behind. Emily watched Silverton grow smaller, the morning sun glinting off window glass and tin roofs. Her heart felt lighter with each mile they covered, though her hands remained tight around her bag. "This is about as far as we go same direction," Mr. Peterson said after a few hours, pulling the wagon to a stop where a narrow trail branched off toward the mountains. "Lord be with you, Miss Hensley." "Thank you kindly," Emily replied, carefully climbing down. She watched the wagon continue on before turning to face the steep path ahead. The wind grew sharper as she climbed, cutting through her shawl and making her eyes water. Pine needles crunched beneath her feet, and melting snow made the rocky trail treacherous. Twice she had to stop to catch her breath, her legs trembling from the effort, but each time she rested she thought of the townspeople's sneers, and pride drove her forward again. The afternoon sun was sinking when Emily finally spotted a thin curl of smoke rising above the pine trees. Relief flooded through her tired body. The cabin must be just ahead. She quickened her pace despite her exhaustion, eager to see her new home. The sight that greeted her, however, made her stop dead in her tracks. This was no abandoned cabin. Freshly split wood was stacked against one wall. A barrel caught rainwater from the roof's edge. Most telling of all, a robust cooking fire sent that smoke spiraling up from a well-maintained chimney. Before Emily could process what this meant, the cabin's door swung open with a creak. Filling the doorway was the largest man she'd ever seen. His wild, dark hair and beard were shot through with gray, and his piercing eyes fixed on her with clear hostility. Across his massive arms rested a rifle, its metal gleaming in the fading light. "You're trespassing," he growled, his voice rough as if unused to speaking. "This here's private property." Emily's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to stand straight. Her trembling fingers found the deed in her pocket. I have papers," she stammered, holding out the document. "I purchased this cabin today, at auction." The man, who could only be Robert Brandt, the hermit she'd heard whispered about in town, stepped forward and snatched the paper from her hand. His eyes narrowed as he studied it in the dying light. "Government's got no right," he finally spat. "Been living here 15 years. Built this place with my own hands. They can't just sell what ain't theirs to sell." "I'm sorry," Emily said, finding her voice growing steadier. "But I paid for this property, fair and square. I have nowhere else to go." "Not my problem." Robert thrust the deed back at her. "Town's that way." He jerked his thumb back down the trail. Emily looked at the darkening sky, then down at her mud-caked shoes. Her legs felt like lead, and the thought of descending the treacherous path in darkness made her dizzy. But it was more than physical exhaustion that made her stand her ground. "No," she said quietly. Robert's bushy eyebrows rose. "No? I won't go back." Emily lifted her chin. "Not to be laughed at. Not to prove them right. This is my property now, legally purchased. I mean to stay?" A tense silence fell between them. The wind whispered through pine needles, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled. Robert's grip tightened on his rifle, but Emily held his gaze steadily, though her heart felt ready to burst from her chest. Finally, Robert let out a sound somewhere between a growl and a sigh. "Night's coming on," he said gruffly. "Ain't Christian to send a woman into the dark." He stepped back from the doorway. "You can have the cot by the fire. One night. Come morning, you go back where you came from." Emily's legs nearly buckled with relief as she stepped into the cabin's warmth. The interior was surprisingly neat, if spare. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and delicious smells wafted from a pot hanging above it. Simple wooden furniture, a table, chairs, shelves, showed signs of skilled craftsmanship. Robert pointed to a narrow cot in the corner near the hearth. "There. Don't touch nothing else." Emily set her carpetbag beside the cot and perched on its edge, keeping her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Robert returned to a chair by the fire, rifle still across his knees, watching her with open suspicion. The silence stretched between them as darkness settled outside. Emily sat very still, acutely aware she was sharing space with a man who clearly wished her gone. But as she watched the firelight dance across the cabin's walls, she felt an unexpected sense of rightness. This place, despite its current occupant, felt more like home, than her rented room ever had. She knew morning would bring another confrontation. But for now, she was grateful for the warmth of the fire and the solid roof above her head. Emily sent up a silent prayer of thanks, even as she wondered what the next day would bring. Emily spent a restless night on the narrow cot, too aware of Robert's hulking presence across the cabin. The fire's dying embers cast dancing shadows on the log walls, and every creak of timber made her start. Still, exhaustion eventually pulled her into fitful sleep. She woke to the rhythmic thud of an axe. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window, and Robert's chair stood empty. Emily smoothed her rumpled skirts and retrieved a small sack of oats from her carpet bag. The cabin's interior looked different in daylight, weathered but solid, with careful craftsmanship evident in every joint and beam. The pot still hung over the cold hearth. Emily busied herself building up the fire and setting oats to cook, trying to ignore how her hands trembled. She had to prove herself useful somehow, or Robert would surely drive her away. The door creaked open, and Robert entered with an armload of split wood. His shirt, she noticed, was more patch than original fabric, with a fresh tear along one shoulder. His boots were worse, the leather cracked and separating from the soles. "I made enough for 2, Emily said softly, stirring the bubbling porridge. Robert grunted, dropping the wood beside the hearth. He stood awkwardly for a moment, then settled into his chair, watching her with wary eyes. Emily spooned portions into 2 tin bowls, offering one to Robert. He took it without comment, but she noticed he ate every bite. When he set the empty bowl aside, Emily gathered her courage. I couldn't help but notice your shirt is torn," she said, hands clasped tight in her lap. "I'm a seamstress by trade. I could mend it for you if you'd like." Robert's laugh was harsh. "Don't need charity, woman." "Not charity," Emily replied quickly. "Just being neighborly, though I reckon we're more like reluctant roommates at the moment." Something that might have been amusement flickered in Robert's eyes. Without a word, he shrugged out of the worn shirt and tossed it her way. Emily caught it, trying not to stare at his bare shoulders as he pulled on a slightly less ragged spare. While Robert went out to split more wood, Emily examined the cabin more closely. The morning light revealed worrying signs, sagging timbers where snow had weighted the roof, gaps between logs that let in drafts. When Robert returned, she pointed out these concerns. "Cabin stood 15 years, he growled. "It'll stand 15 more." "But if we just—" Emily began, but the thunder of approaching hooves cut her off. Robert's hand went to his rifle as a well-dressed man on a gleaming bay horse appeared around the bend. The stranger's bowler hat and crisp suit marked him as a city man, though trail dust coated his boots. "Good morning," the man called with a practiced smile. "I'm Agent Wilson, representing the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." He dismounted smoothly, pulling papers from his saddlebag. "I'm afraid I have some rather unfortunate news about this property." Emily's heart sank as the agent approached, but she forced herself to stand tall beside Robert. "This entire section has been condemned for railroad development," Wilson announced, unfurling a map. "We're running a spur line through here. Progress, you understand. I have the official notices right here." "I purchased this property yesterday," Emily protested, producing her deed with trembling fingers. "At public auction, all legal and proper." Wilson's smile turned condescending as he examined her paper. "My dear lady, this deed is effectively worthless without proper occupation of the property. As I understand it, you've only just arrived. The railroad's claim takes precedence." "Been living here 15 years, Robert growled. "Built every log of it myself." "Ah, but do you have documentation of ownership, sir?" Wilson's tone grew oily. "Tax records? Legal deed? No? Then I'm afraid you're simply a squatter with no rights to the property." Robert's hands clenched into fists. A string of curses rumbled in his chest, but he held his tongue. "You can't just take people's homes," Emily said, her voice stronger than she felt. "It isn't right." "Progress waits for no one, madam." Wilson refolded his papers with precise movements. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, we'll be forced to take other measures." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good day to you both." They watched in silence as the agent mounted and rode away. Emily's legs felt weak, and she sank onto a nearby stump. Robert stood rigid, staring after the disappearing rider with murder in his eyes. "What are we going to do?" Emily whispered. Robert's head snapped toward her. Yes, we." Emily straightened her spine. "Like it or not, we're in this together now. My deed might be new, but it's legal. Your long occupation gives you rights too, even without papers. But separately, we'll both lose everything." Robert turned away, axe swinging in his grip, but Emily pressed on. "I need this place, Mr. Brandt, just as much as you do, and I reckon you could use help keeping it up. Proper repairs, good meals, mended clothes. We could pool our strengths." The axe bit deep into a log. Robert worked in silence as the sun climbed higher, splitting wood with controlled fury. Emily retreated to the cabin, knowing better than to push further. She busied herself with his torn shirt, her needle flashing in the light from the window. Evening settled over the mountain, bringing with it the first stars and a chill wind. Emily stirred a pot of rabbit stew, Robert's contribution, while he brought in more firewood. The silence between them felt different now, charged with shared concern rather than hostile wariness. As they sat with their bowls, Emily tried one more time. "Mr. Brandt, Robert, we don't have to like each other, but we do need each other if either of us wants to keep this home." She paused, stirring her stew. "I'm not asking for friendship. Just an alliance. Against them." Robert stared into his bowl for a long moment. He didn't answer, but when Emily moved to prepare her cot for another night, he didn't object. Sometimes, she reflected, silence could be its own kind of answer. The fire crackled between them as darkness gathered outside. Emily's fingers worked steadily at Robert's shirt, adding neat stitches to reinforce worn seams. Across the cabin, Robert pulled out a piece of wood and began whittling, his knife creating soft scraping sounds that blended with the pop of burning logs. They had spoken no words of agreement, made no formal arrangement. But as Emily looked around the cabin, her deed in her pocket, Robert's presence solid and permanent as the mountains themselves, she felt the first stirring of hope. Sometimes the strongest bonds formed in silence, born of shared purpose, rather than spoken promises. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountain. Emily stood beside Robert at the cabin's edge, neck craned back to study the sagging roofline. Her hands clutched a hammer that felt awkwardly heavy, while Robert balanced several fresh-cut shingles under one arm. "Mind them nails," Robert grunted, steadying the ladder. "Don't want to be wasting any—" Emily climbed carefully, her skirts gathered and pinned for better movement. The roof felt solid enough under her feet, but patches of rotted wood showed where snow had pooled and eaten through. Robert passed up shingles one by one, watching with poorly hidden concern as she positioned herself. The first swing of her hammer barely dented the nail. Emily's cheeks flushed, but she persisted, each strike growing more confident. By mid-morning, her arms ached fiercely, but a neat row of new shingles gleamed in the sunlight. "Reckon that'll keep the weather out," Robert admitted, studying her work. Something like respect flickered in his eyes. Over the next few days, a routine emerged. Robert began showing Emily the skills needed for mountain living, though his teaching style was gruff and sparse with words. He demonstrated how to split logs along their grain, the axe handle smooth from years of use. "Like this," he'd say, positioning her hands. "Let the weight do the work." Emily's first attempts sent the axe glancing dangerously off the wood. But Robert's steady presence behind her helped her find the rhythm, and soon enough she could split smaller logs on her own. With rope work, Robert's expertise showed in the intricate knots that secured their supplies. His huge fingers moved with surprising delicacy as he taught Emily basic hitches and loops. She practiced until her fingers were raw, determined to master each one. "Might need these someday," was all he said, but Emily understood the importance of self-reliance in their isolated home. Setting snares proved trickier. Emily's city-bred hands struggled with the fine wire, but Robert showed unexpected patience. He guided her through the process repeatedly until she could set a basic trap. Her first caught rabbit brought a proud smile to her face. In return, Emily transformed their cabin's interior. She cooked hearty stews and fresh bread, the warm scents filling their home. Robert's portions grew larger as he discovered her skill with seasoning game meat. Though he rarely commented, his cleaned plate spoke volumes. Her needle flew through his worn clothing, adding sturdy patches and reinforced seams. Robert would silently leave torn items on her chair and find them mended by evening. The pile of repaired clothing grew steadily. When Sunday arrived, Emily dressed in her best dress, though it was plain by town standards. She was surprised to find Robert waiting outside with 2 horses saddled. "Can't let you walk all that way," he muttered, helping her mount. The trail into town wound through stands of aspen and pine. Robert rode slightly ahead, his broad shoulders tense as they approached civilization. Emily noticed how he kept one hand near his rifle, eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The little church's bell was ringing as they arrived. Emily dismounted gracefully, but Robert hesitated before following her toward the white-painted building. Townsfolk gathered on the steps stopped their conversations to stare. "Look at that," one woman whispered too loudly. "The widow and the wild man." "Heard she's living up there with him," another added. "All alone, can you imagine?" Emily lifted her chin and walked proudly through their midst. Robert ducked his head to clear the doorway, his massive frame making the church seem suddenly small. Children giggled at the sight, but fell silent at his glower. The service proceeded normally, though Emily felt the weight of curious eyes. Robert sat stiffly beside her, his knees cramped by the narrow pew. He studied the hymnal with furrowed brow, but remained silent during the singing. Afterward, more whispers followed them down the church steps. Emily noticed Robert's jaw clenching, his discomfort evident in every line of his body, but he waited patiently while she exchanged brief pleasantries with the minister. The ride home was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. As they crested the final ridge, Emily felt tension leave her shoulders at the sight of their cabin. The afternoon sun caught the new shingles, making them gleam like promise. Inside, Emily unpinned her hat and smoothed her skirts. She took her Bible from her bag and walked purposefully to the stone mantel. Robert watched as she placed it carefully between his wooden carvings, a bear, a hawk, and what might have been a half-finished deer. "This is our home now," she said simply, running her hand along the worn leather cover. Proper and true. Robert said nothing, but his expression softened as Emily knelt beside her chair. Her prayers were quiet, personal things, but her face showed peace that seemed to fill the cabin's corners. Later, as shadows lengthened across the floor, Emily caught Robert studying the Bible where it sat. His weathered fingers touched its spine briefly before he turned away, but something had changed in his face. The hardness there had cracked, just slightly, like spring ice beginning to thaw. They ate their evening meal in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a hunting owl. Emily's needle flashed in the firelight as she worked on another of Robert's shirts. Robert whittled by the hearth, his knife creating gentle scraping sounds that blended with the evening's peace. The partnership they'd formed was fragile still, built on necessity and cautious trust. But like the new shingles overhead and the mended clothes in their chest, it was holding firm, growing stronger with each shared day and task. 2 lives, as different as could be, slowly weaving together into something new and unexpectedly strong. Winter crept across the mountain like a silent predator, wrapping the cabin in layers of white silence. Emily woke each morning before the sun touched the peaks, her breath visible in the cold air as she slipped from beneath her quilts. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the stone fireplace, where embers glowed weakly in the pre-dawn darkness. She had learned the art of fire building from Robert's patient demonstrations. Her fingers, still stiff with cold, arranged kindling just so, coaxing the flames back to life. The familiar scent of coffee soon filled the cabin, a morning ritual that brought comfort to them both. Robert's heavy footsteps on the porch announced his return from early morning hunting. Snow fell from his shoulders as he ducked through the doorway, bringing with him the sharp scent of pine and winter air. Emily handed him a steaming cup without comment, having learned his preference for quiet mornings. "Storm's coming," he said finally, nodding toward the window where heavy clouds gathered above the tree line. "Best get extra wood in." They worked together through the morning, Robert splitting logs while Emily stacked them along the cabin's inner walls. The first snowflakes began falling just as they finished, fat white flakes that quickly became a driving curtain of white. For 3 days, the storm raged. Wind howled through every crack, despite Emily's careful caulking with strips of cloth. They took turns shoveling snow from the roof, fighting to prevent the weight from crushing their recent repairs. Emily's arms ached from the work, but she pressed on, knowing their survival depended on it. The third night brought the worst cold. Their firewood, though carefully rationed, had dwindled dangerously. Emily huddled near the dying flames, wrapped in every quilt she owned, but still shivered uncontrollably. "Can't let you freeze," Robert said gruffly. He settled beside her, adding his own blankets to create a shared nest of warmth. Emily tensed at first, then gradually relaxed as his solid presence drove back the deadly chill. They sat in silence, watching the last log burn down, their shared body heat the only thing standing between them and the bitter cold. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving a transformed world of pristine white. The sun sparked diamonds from every surface, nearly blinding in its intensity. They emerged to find drifts taller than Emily's head, but the cabin had held firm. As winter settled into its rhythm, they developed new patterns of survival. Emily learned to read the weather in the way smoke rose from their chimney, in the behavior of the winter birds that gathered hopefully near their door. Robert showed her how to spot game trails beneath the snow, though she still preferred to let him do the actual hunting. One evening, as Emily sat by lamplight working on a torn jacket, she noticed Robert studying her deed where it lay on the mantel beside her Bible. His expression was troubled, fingers tracing the official seal. "Never did trust paper promises," he said quietly. "Seen too many broken. That's why I never filed proper claim papers on this place." Emily set aside her mending, choosing her words carefully. "May I show you something?" She retrieved her deed, spreading it carefully on the table between them. "See this date? If we can prove the cabin existed before the railroad's claim, this deed might hold legal weight. We'd have prior claim." Robert's massive shoulders hunched defensively. "Government men don't care about mountain folks' rights." "Perhaps not," Emily agreed, "but they do care about proper documentation. There must be records somewhere, survey maps, land office files, something to prove this cabin's age." Robert was silent for a long time, studying the fire. Finally, he sighed. "Reckon there might be some old survey maps down in the archive. Used to be a fellow there who marked every cabin he came across, proper filed or not." Hope bloomed in Emily's chest. "Then we should look. Would you help me?" Another long pause, then a reluctant nod. "First light tomorrow. Storm's past, trail should be clear enough for the mule." The next morning dawned clear and cold. Emily wrapped herself in her warmest shawl as Robert helped her mount behind him on the mule. The animal picked its way carefully down the snowy trail, steam rising from its flanks in the crisp air. The town archive occupied a corner of the courthouse basement. A sleepy clerk barely glanced up as they entered, though Emily noticed how he straightened when Robert's massive frame filled the doorway. Dust lay thick on the shelves of leather-bound books and rolled maps. Emily sneezed repeatedly as they began their search, but her fingers moved efficiently through the files. Robert stood awkwardly in the corner, clearly uncomfortable, surrounded by so much paper and government authority. "Robert," Emily called softly after an hour of searching. "Come look at this." She had spread a survey map on the reading table, its edges yellow with age. Robert leaned over her shoulder, his breath stirring her hair as he studied the careful ink lines. "See here?" Emily's finger traced a tiny mark in the familiar curve of their mountainside. "It's marked as Trapper's Cabin, dated 1873. That's 7 years before the railroad even began planning this route." Robert squinted at the marking, then slowly nodded. "That'd be it. Remember when that surveyor came through, offered to buy some of my pelts? Must have marked the cabin then." Emily carefully rolled the map, joy making her hands tremble slightly. "This could help us prove our claim." The cabin existed well before the railroad's interest in the land. Robert's weather-lined face showed cautious hope, but his voice remained grave. "Railroad won't give up easy. They've got money for fancy lawyers, men who twist the law to suit them." "Perhaps," Emily agreed, clutching the precious map. "But now we have something solid, a proper government document showing the cabin's history." "It's a start." They checked the map out properly, Emily insisting on following every procedure despite Robert's impatient shuffling. The ride home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts about what this discovery might mean. The winter sun was setting as they reached the cabin, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Emily paused before going inside, drinking in the beauty of their mountain home. The cabin's windows glowed warmly, smoke curling from the chimney into the darkening sky. Whatever came next, she knew this was where she belonged. Robert cleared his throat behind her. "Best get inside. Night's coming on cold." Emily nodded, following him into their shared home. The map they'd found might not solve all their problems, but it offered real hope. Hope that had been in short supply since the railroad agent's threatening visit. She said a silent prayer of thanksgiving as she hung her shawl by the door, ready to face whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. As their mule plodded homeward from town, Emily's mind wandered to possibilities that had been growing in her heart. The late afternoon sun caught the snow in diamond sparkles, making the mountain look like it was draped in a wedding veil. She gathered her courage and spoke. "Robert," she began carefully, "I've been thinking about what we might do with the cabin, once we secure our claim properly." He grunted. A sound she'd learned meant he was listening, even if reluctantly. "There are so many widows and orphans with nowhere to go. Even in town, I see them struggling." Emily's voice grew stronger as she continued. "This cabin could be a sanctuary for them, a place to heal and start fresh, just as it has been for me." Robert turned in his saddle to look at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and something deeper she couldn't quite read. "You'd want to fill our quiet place with strangers?" he asked gruffly. Emily's heart warmed at his use of "our," though she tried not to show it. "Not strangers for long. People who need help, like I did. We have space enough, and skills to teach them." Robert fell silent, guiding the mule around a fallen tree. The only sounds were the crunch of hooves in snow and the distant cry of a hawk. Emily could see him wrestling with the idea, his broad shoulders tense under his coat. That evening, as shadows lengthened across their cabin floor, Robert sat heavily in his chair by the fire. Emily busied herself with supper preparations, giving him space to think. The stew bubbled softly, filling the cabin with the comforting smell of sage and rabbit meat. "Had a dream like that once," he said suddenly, his voice rough with memory. "Building places for folks who needed them. Working with the Ute families up north." Emily stilled her movements, sensing the importance of this moment. She'd never heard him speak of his past before. "Government-made treaty promises," he continued, staring into the fire. "Said if we helped build proper cabins, the Ute could stay on their ancestral lands. I spent 2 years working alongside them, learning their ways, teaching them about white man's building methods." His massive hands clenched into fists. "We built 15 cabins, good ones, with stone foundations and tight walls. The children—" His voice caught slightly. "The children would bring me berries while I worked. Called me tall brother in their language." Emily settled quietly into the chair beside him, her heart aching at the pain in his voice. "Then the soldiers came. New orders, they said. Treaty was worthless paper now. Burned every cabin we'd built, forced the families onto the reservation." Robert's voice turned bitter. "Learned right quick how much government promises are worth." Emily reached out slowly, laying her hand on his weathered arm. She felt the muscles tense under her touch, then gradually relax. "Not all promises are broken, Robert," she said softly. "Some people still believe in keeping their word." He looked down at her small hand on his arm, then up at her face. The firelight caught the tears in her eyes, and something in his expression shifted. "Reckon you might be right about that," he admitted quietly. Over the next week, Emily began putting her dream into gentle action. When families passed on the trail below their cabin, she would wave and offer fresh bread to their children. At first, parents were wary of the strange pair, the widow and the mountain man, but the scent of warm bread and Emily's genuine kindness gradually won them over. Robert made a show of grumbling about the intrusions, retreating to his workbench in the corner. But Emily noticed how his knife moved purposefully through pieces of pine wood, carefully shaping small animals and toys. He would leave them casually on the table, pretending not to notice when Emily slipped them to the wide-eyed children. One afternoon, she watched him present a perfectly carved little horse to a girl with a broken arm, showing her how the legs moved on tiny pins. The child's delighted smile seemed to take years off Robert's weathered face. "You're good with them," Emily observed that evening as they sat by the fire. "The children, I mean." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Just whittling. Keeps my hands busy." "It's more than that," Emily pressed gently. "You see what each one needs. Like that little horse today. How did you know she lost her real pony in the spring floods?" He shrugged, but Emily caught the slight flush under his beard. "Heard her pa talking about it when they passed by last month. Figured she might like something to remember it by." Emily studied him in the firelight, seeing past the gruff exterior to the gentle heart beneath. This man, who had known such betrayal, still found ways to offer kindness. Her own heart swelled with emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. "The cabin feels more alive now," she said carefully. "With children's laughter in it sometimes." Robert was quiet for a long moment, his knife moving steadily over a new piece of wood. "Reckon it does," he finally agreed. "Been a while since these walls heard such sounds." Emily watched his strong hands shape the wood with surprising delicacy. "Could hear more of it," she suggested. "If we make this place what I dream it could be." He looked up at her then, really looked at her, and Emily felt her breath catch at the mix of fear and longing in his eyes. "Your dream's a good one," he said slowly. "But folk can be cruel to those who are different. Town's already talking about us up here." "Let them talk," Emily said firmly. "We know what's true. We know what this place could mean to those who need it." Robert's knife stilled. "We do," he agreed quietly. The firelight caught the silver in his hair, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of both pain and laughter. "Might be worth trying. Once we're sure the railroad can't take it all away. Emily's heart leapt at this first real agreement to her plan, but she kept her voice steady. One step at a time, she said. First, we secure our claim. Then we build something new here, together. Robert nodded, returning to his whittling. But Emily saw the small smile hiding in his beard, and her own hopes for their future grew stronger. The cabin around them creaked gently in the winter wind, solid and welcoming, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. Dawn painted the mountain peaks with golden light, but Emily's heart grew heavy as hoofbeats echoed up the trail. Through the cabin's frosted window, she spotted Sheriff Tom Keene's familiar brown coat and silver badge glinting in the morning sun. Robert tensed beside her, his massive frame filling the doorway as the lawman approached. "Got some official business here?" Sheriff Keene announced, dismounting with a grunt. His breath formed white clouds in the frigid air as he pulled a stack of papers from his saddlebag. Frost crunched under his boots as he walked toward them. Emily's fingers trembled as she gripped her coffee cup. "What sort of business, Sheriff?" "Court orders." He held out the documents, his expression carefully neutral. "Eviction notices. Railroad's claim has been upheld. You folks got 30 days to clear out." "That's impossible," Emily protested, setting down her cup and reaching for the deed she kept carefully folded in her apron pocket. "I have legal ownership. We found survey records proving the cabin existed before." "Sorry, Mrs. Hensley." The sheriff cut her off with a wave of his hand. "My hands are tied. Courts have ruled in the railroad's favor. Nothing personal, just doing my job." Robert's low growl rumbled from deep in his chest. "Your job is protecting folks from being robbed of their homes." Sheriff Keene wouldn't meet Robert's eyes. "Law's the law. 30 days, starting today." He tacked the notice to their doorpost, turned on his heel, and rode away without another word. Emily stared at the official paper fluttering in the icy wind. All their hopes, all their plans for making this place a sanctuary, could it really end like this? She felt Robert's presence behind her, solid and warm despite the morning chill. "This ain't right," he muttered, reading the notice over her shoulder. "Railroad's got no claim here. They're twisting the law to suit themselves." Emily touched his arm gently. "We'll find another way. Perhaps if we speak to the judge directly." But Robert was already striding toward the barn, his face dark with purpose. "Time for talking's done. They want to play rough? Fine by me." "Robert, wait!" Emily hurried after him, her skirts whispering across the frozen ground. "What are you planning?" He was saddling his mule, his movements sharp with anger. "Going to town. Make those railroad men face me man to man, not hide behind their fancy papers." "Please," Emily begged, catching his sleeve. "Don't do anything rash." "Violence won't solve this." Robert paused, his large hand covering hers for a moment. "Trust me, Emily. I know how these types operate. Sometimes a man's got to stand his ground." She watched helplessly as he rode away, his broad shoulders rigid with determination. Prayer was all she could offer now, and she sent one heavenward as his figure disappeared down the trail. The afternoon stretched endlessly. Emily tried to keep busy, mending clothes, sweeping floors, anything to keep her mind off what might be happening in town. As dusk approached, she heard shouting from the direction of the saloon, her heart seized with fear. Gathering her shawl, Emily hitched up their wagon as quickly as she could. The old horse protested the late hour but responded to her urgent commands. The road into town seemed longer than ever, each bump and rut testing her patience. As she approached Main Street, she saw a crowd gathered outside the Golden Nugget Saloon. The sound of breaking glass and angry voices filled the air. Emily's hands tightened on the reins as she pulled the wagon to a stop. Inside the saloon, Robert stood surrounded by railroad men, his back against the bar. Despite his size, he was clearly trying to avoid violence, deflecting punches rather than throwing them. But there were too many opponents, all clearly spoiling for a fight. "Stop this!" Emily cried from the doorway, but her voice was lost in the chaos. A bottle crashed against the wall near Robert's head. He ducked, then caught one attacker's fist before it could connect with his jaw. Another man tried to hit him from behind with a chair, but Robert twisted away, letting the furniture splinter against the bar instead. "That's enough!" Sheriff Keene's voice cut through the commotion. He stood in the doorway, rifle raised. "Everyone stand down!" The railroad men backed away, smirking. Robert straightened slowly, his shirt torn, but his dignity intact. He hadn't thrown a single punch, Emily realized with pride. But it didn't matter. She could see this had been a setup from the start. "Disturbing the peace," the sheriff announced, producing handcuffs. "Destroying property, causing a public nuisance. You're under arrest, Brandt." "He was defending himself," Emily protested, pushing through the crowd. "These men attacked him." The sheriff ignored her, roughly securing the cuffs around Robert's wrists. "Tell it to the judge tomorrow. For now, you're spending the night in jail." Emily followed them to the jailhouse, her heart pounding. Through the gathering darkness, she could see the railroad agent watching from the shadows, satisfaction clear on his face. This had been his plan all along. Remove Robert, leave her alone and vulnerable. The cell door clanged shut with terrible finality. Robert gripped the cold bars, his face tight with concern, as he looked at Emily. "Don't trust any of them," he warned quietly. "Not the sheriff, not the judge, nobody. They're all in the railroad's pocket." "I'll find a way to help you," Emily promised, reaching through the bars to touch his bruised hand. "We'll fight this together." "Go back to the cabin," Robert urged. "Lock the doors. I don't trust these snakes not to try something while I'm stuck in here." Sheriff Keene cleared his throat meaningfully. "Visiting hours are over, Mrs. Hensley." Emily reluctantly stepped back from the cell. The weight of separation pressed down on her chest as she walked out into the snowy night. White flakes drifted silently around her as she climbed into the wagon, each one feeling like a tear from heaven itself. The ride back to the cabin was lonely and cold. Emily's mind raced with worry. For Robert, for their home, for all their dreams of making this place a sanctuary for others. The eviction notice seemed to mock her as she passed through the door, its official seal gleaming dully in the lamplight. She built up the fire and wrapped herself in a quilt, but nothing could warm the chill of fear in her heart. Without Robert's solid presence, the cabin felt empty and vulnerable. Every creak of the timbers, every whisper of wind made her start. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "give me strength. Show me the way forward. Don't let them take everything we've built here." Snow continued falling outside, covering their mountain world in silence. Emily sat alone by the fire, her heart aching with each beat, wondering how they would ever find their way through this storm. The morning after Robert's arrest dawned cold and gray. Emily stood at the cabin door, watching her breath form clouds in the frigid air. The water bucket sat empty by her feet, a task Robert usually handled before sunrise. With a deep breath, she grabbed the wooden handle and started down the path to the creek. The icy water numbed her fingers as she filled the bucket. Its weight seemed to double on the uphill climb back to the cabin. Halfway there, she had to stop and rest, her arms trembling. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, then pressed on. By mid-morning, her back ached from hauling wood for the stove. Robert had always made it look so easy, splitting logs and stacking them neatly by the door. Emily's pile was messier, the pieces smaller, but they would have to do. She couldn't bear the thought of letting their home grow cold. The cabin felt larger somehow, emptier without Robert's commanding presence. His chair sat vacant by the fire, his whittling knife still on the table where he'd left it. Emily found herself talking aloud just to break the silence. "The stew needs more salt," she'd say to no one, or, "That wind sounds like snow coming." Each time, the silence that followed made her heart ache anew. Through it all, she prayed. while stirring thin soup for her solitary meals, while mending Robert's spare shirt that still needed patching, while lying alone in her narrow bed, listening to the wind moan through the pines. "Please keep him safe," she would whisper. "Please show us the way through this trial." Sunday arrived with fresh snow. Emily dressed carefully in her best dress, though the hem was damp before she'd walked 100 yards. The church bells echoed across the valley as she approached town, their bronze voices offering little comfort today. Inside the whitewashed building, heads turned as she entered alone. The whispers started immediately, carried on the warm air like poison. That mountain man finally showed his true colors. Always knew he was dangerous. Poor woman, mixed up with such a brute. Emily held her head high and took her usual seat, though her cheeks burned with shame and anger. These people didn't know Robert. They hadn't seen his gentleness with children, his quiet strength, his careful hands carving delicate wooden figures by firelight. After the service, Pastor Dillard approached her with his usual mild expression. "Mrs. Hensley, such an unfortunate business with Mr. Brandt. Perhaps this is a sign that you should reconsider your situation." "Robert was defending himself," Emily said firmly. "He's a good man who's been wronged." The pastor smiled weakly. Now. Best leave such matters to the proper authorities. I'm sure everything will work out as it should." Emily wanted to shake him, to demand he stand up for justice instead of hiding behind pleasant platitudes, but she merely nodded stiffly and turned away. His cowardice was no surprise, but it still stung. Monday morning found her climbing the courthouse steps, her deed and the survey maps clutched in trembling hands. The judge's chamber smelled of pipe tobacco and leather-bound books. Judge Harrison barely looked up from his papers as she entered. "Your Honor, please," Emily began. "I've brought evidence that our cabin predates any railroad claim, and Robert Brandt was clearly provoked into that fight. Those men were waiting for him, planning to." "Mrs. Hensley." The judge's tone carried weary dismissal. "You're a widow with no standing in this matter. The railroad's claim has been properly filed and approved. As for Mr. Brandt's criminal behavior, that will be dealt with in due course." "But the cabin is legally mine," Emily protested. "I have the deed right here." "A deed obtained under questionable circumstances for land that was never properly registered." He shuffled papers meaningfully. "Good day, Mrs. Hensley." Emily stumbled down the courthouse steps, vision blurred with tears she refused to shed in public. She managed to hold them back until she reached the cabin, but there her control finally broke. Collapsing into Robert's empty chair by the fire, she wept until her throat was raw. "Why, Lord," she cried into the gathering darkness, "why must good men suffer while the wicked prosper? How can I fight these powerful men alone?" The cabin offered no answer beyond the crackle of the fire and the lonely wind in the chimney. Emily's hands found her worn Bible on the mantel, its pages soft with use. Opening to the Psalms, she began to read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each verse. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The familiar words washed over her like healing balm. She read on, taking comfort in David's ancient prayers, his faith in the face of enemies, his trust in God's justice, his hope in the darkest hours. As the last light faded outside, Emily closed the Bible and wiped her eyes. She was not alone, not truly, and perhaps that was the answer she needed. The next morning, she rose before dawn with renewed purpose. Robert's innocence might be proved through witnesses. Surely someone in the saloon that night had seen the truth. The cabin's history could be verified through old-timers who remembered its construction. She packed a small basket with bread and cheese, then set out toward the cluster of homesteads scattered through the valley. Someone must remember when Robert first came to these mountains. Someone must have seen him working with the Ute families years ago, building cabins under those broken treaties. "God hasn't abandoned us," she whispered as she walked into the rising sun. "And I won't abandon our dream of making this place a sanctuary. Not while there's breath in my body and hope in my heart." The mountain air was sharp and clean in her lungs, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Ahead lay a long day of knocking on doors, asking questions, gathering stories. But Emily felt stronger now, steadied by prayer and purpose. Robert had taught her to survive in these mountains. Now she would fight to bring him home to them. For 5 days straight, Emily trudged through melting snow and mud, visiting every homestead within walking distance of the cabin. Her boots, already worn thin, developed holes that let in the cold slush. Still, she pressed on, driven by desperate hope that someone might remember the cabin's true history. The late winter sun cast long shadows as she approached each door, clutching her shawl against the biting wind. Some settlers were kind enough to invite her in for coffee, but their memories proved frustratingly vague. "Reckon that cabin's been there long as I can remember, old mister," Peterson mused, scratching his gray beard. "But can't rightly say who built it or when." Others weren't nearly so welcoming. The Hendersons' door slammed in her face before she could finish explaining her quest. Through the window, she heard Mrs. Henderson's shrill voice. "We ain't crossing the railroad not for nobody." By the 5th afternoon, Emily's spirits had sunk low as the winter sun. Her feet ached, and her throat felt raw from telling the same story over and over. Resting on a fallen log, she pulled out the last of her bread and cheese. The food tasted like ash in her mouth. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm trying to keep faith. But I'm so tired, and every door seems closed." A crow's harsh call made her look up. Through the bare trees, she spotted smoke rising from a small cabin she hadn't noticed before. It sat apart from the other homesteads, nearly hidden in a grove of aspens near the reservation boundary. Emily hesitated. She'd heard townspeople speak unkindly of the old Indian woman who lived out here alone, but something in her heart urged her forward. Perhaps it was desperation, or perhaps it was the Holy Spirit's gentle nudge. As she approached, she noticed the cabin's neat appearance: swept yard, carefully stacked firewood, herbs drying under the eaves. An elderly woman sat in a rocking chair on the porch, her silver hair in 2 long braids. She watched Emily's approach with dark, steady eyes. Emily's throat tightened with nervous hope. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Emily Hensley." The woman nodded slightly but said nothing. "I'm sorry to disturb you," Emily continued, "but I'm trying to learn about an old cabin up on Cedar Ridge, the one Robert Brant lives in now." At Robert's name, something flickered in the woman's expression. She studied Emily for a long moment, then spoke in careful English. "I am Wachiwi. You come inside. Too cold for talk out here." Relief flooded through Emily as she followed Wachiwi into the cabin. The interior was warm and tidy, with colorful woven blankets on the walls and bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters. A kettle steamed on the wood stove. "Sit." Wachiwi gestured to a chair, then began preparing tea in 2 tin cups. "You tell me why you ask about Robert's cabin?" Emily's words spilled out like water from a broken dam. How she'd bought the cabin at auction, how Robert had reluctantly accepted her presence, how they'd worked together to make it a real home. Her voice shook as she described his arrest and the railroad's threats. "They say we have no right to be there," she finished, "that the land was never properly claimed. But Robert told me he built it years ago, working with Ute families under some kind of treaty agreement." Wachiwi's weathered face grew still. She set down her tea and walked to an old trunk in the corner. From its depths, she withdrew a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns. "My husband, Gray Owl, he helped build that cabin," she said softly. "Many years ago, when treaties say we could work with white settlers if both sides agree. Robert Brant, he different from other white men. He treat us like people, not animals." Emily's heart began to pound. "You remember it being built?" "You're certain?" Wachiwi opened the box and removed something wrapped in soft leather. "Gray Owl and Robert, they make special marks on cabin logs. Show treaty work being done proper way. When cabin finished, they trade tokens." She unwrapped the leather, revealing a small wooden carving, 2 hands clasped together. "Robert have same token," Wachiwi continued. "Show partnership, show trust. But soldiers come next year, burn other cabins, drive our people to reservation. Gray Owl die of fever that winter." Her voice grew distant with old grief. "I keep token to remember good days, when some whites and Utes try to live as neighbors." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks. "Oh, thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for telling me this. Would you be willing to tell this story in court, to help save the cabin?" Wachiwi's expression grew grave. "White court not like Indian words. They laugh, say we lie." "Please." Emily reached across and took the older woman's hand. "I know it's asking so much, but without your testimony, without proof the cabin was built under treaty terms, we'll lose everything. And Robert? He's in jail now, accused of fighting when he was only defending himself." Wachiwi's fingers tightened around Emily's. "Robert, good man. He remember old promises when others forget." She straightened her shoulders. "I will speak, for Gray Owl's memory, for treaty, truth." Fresh tears fell as Emily squeezed Wachiwi's hand. "God bless you. I've been praying so hard for help, and he led me right to your door." A faint smile touched Wachiwi's lips. "Creator works in strange ways. Now you eat something before walk to town. Too skinny from all this worry." She brought out cornbread and dried berries, insisting Emily eat her fill. As the light began to fade, they set out together toward town. Emily matched her pace to Wachiwi's careful steps, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The token in Wachiwi's box, the memory of hands joined in partnership. Surely this was the evidence they needed. Robert's cabin had been built in good faith, under treaty terms. The railroad couldn't simply sweep that history aside. As they walked, Wachiwi spoke more about those earlier days. How Robert had learned a few Ute words, how he'd insisted on paying fair wages for their work, how he'd stood against other settlers who objected to Indians and whites working together. "He carry much anger now," she observed, "much pain from broken promises, but good heart still there, under all that hurt." Emily nodded, thinking of Robert's gruff kindness, his gentle way with children, his quiet strength. "Yes," she said softly. "I've seen it too." The lights of town began to twinkle through the gathering dusk. Emily's pulse quickened with nervous anticipation. Tomorrow they would go to the courthouse together. Tomorrow they would fight for truth, for justice, for home. But tonight, walking beside this wise woman who had survived so much, Emily felt the warm certainty of God's providence. He had not abandoned them. He had led her footsteps to exactly where she needed to be. The courthouse steps felt steeper than ever as Emily climbed them with Wachiwi. Inside, the clerk's expression soured at the sight of them. He made them wait 2 hours before finally accepting their petition to testify. "Waste of the court's time," he muttered, scratching their names into his ledger with obvious disdain. Walking back into the late afternoon bustle of Main Street, Emily noticed how people stepped aside, casting suspicious glances their way. Mrs. Henderson hurried her children across the street when she spotted them. Outside the general store, a cluster of men fell silent, watching them pass with hard eyes. "Hold your head high," Wachiwi said quietly. "They fear truth more than lies." Before Emily could respond, the railroad agent stepped out of the telegraph office, blocking their path. His polished boots gleamed in the winter sun, and his bowler hat cast a shadow across his face. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, voice dripping with false concern. "A word, if you please." Emily's spine stiffened. "Whatever you have to say can be said here." He glanced dismissively at Wachewi. "I'm trying to help you, madam. Surely you realize what associating with certain elements will do to your standing in this community." "My standing?" Emily's voice trembled with anger. "You mean like having the sheriff arrest an innocent man, or stealing land that was rightfully settled under treaty terms?" The agent's smile thinned. "Be reasonable. No judge will take the word of a savage over proper documentation. You're only hurting yourself by pursuing this unfortunate course." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Think carefully. A widow alone can't afford to make powerful enemies." "I am not alone," Emily said firmly. She felt Wachewi's steady presence beside her, drawing strength from it. "And I would rather stand with honest people than curry favor with thieves who hide behind paper laws." Color rose in the agent's face. "You'll regret this foolishness," he snapped, all pretense of courtesy gone. "When you're driven out of town with nothing but the clothes on your back, remember I tried to warn you." He stormed off, leaving Emily shaking but unbowed. Wachewi touched her arm gently. "You speak with warrior's heart," she said. "Creator gives strength to those who defend truth." Emily managed a weak smile. "I pray you're right. I should go see Robert now. He needs to know you've agreed to help." The jail sat at the edge of town, a squat building of gray stone. The deputy barely looked up from his newspaper as Emily entered. She found Robert pacing his cell like a caged bear, his massive frame making the space seem even smaller. When he saw her, he gripped the iron bars. "Emily, are you all right? Has anyone threatened you?" "I'm fine," she assured him, touched by his concern. "Robert, listen. I found someone who remembers when the cabin was built, someone who can prove it was done properly under the treaty." Hope and wariness warred in his expression. "Who?" "Wachewi. Her husband helped build it. She still has the token you exchanged when it was finished." Robert's eyes widened. "Gray Owl's widow? She's still alive?" His voice roughened. "I thought, after they forced everyone onto the reservation?" "She's alive and strong and willing to testify." "She remembers everything, Robert. The marks you made on the logs, the agreement between you and her husband, all of it." Robert turned away, but not before Emily saw the shimmer of tears in his eyes. When he faced her again, his usual stoic mask had cracked. He reached through the bars to clasp her hand. "You're braver than me," he admitted hoarsely. "I gave up fighting their lies years ago, hid myself away instead of standing up for what was right." Emily squeezed his calloused fingers. "You protected what you could. But now we can fight together, you, me, and Wachewi. God didn't bring us all together by accident." "You really believe that? That he's watching out for a bunch of broken-down misfits like us?" "With all my heart," Emily said softly. "Every closed door led me to that cabin. Every cruel word made me stronger. And now, when we needed it most, he led me right to the one person who could help save our home." Robert's grip tightened. "Our home," he repeated wonderingly. Then his expression darkened. "The railroad won't give up easily. That agent, he's a snake. He'll try to discredit Wachewi's testimony, make it seem worthless. Let him try. Truth is truth, whether they want to hear it or not." A ghost of a smile touched Robert's lips. "When did you get so fierce, widow woman?" "I learned it from a grumpy mountain man who wouldn't let me give up," she teased gently. The deputy cleared his throat loudly, signaling visiting hours were over. Emily reluctantly withdrew her hand. "I'll bring you clean clothes tomorrow. And maybe some of that bread you pretend not to like." "Emily?" Robert's voice stopped her at the door. "Thank you. For not giving up on the cabin. For not giving up on me." She nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. The walk back to the cabin took longer in the gathering dusk. Fresh snow had begun to fall, dusting Emily's shawl with white. Inside, she built up the fire and set about mixing bread dough. Enough for Robert and extra to take to Wachiwi tomorrow as a thank you gift. As she kneaded, she hummed old hymns her mother had taught her. The familiar motions and melodies soothed her spirit. Outside, the snow fell thicker, but inside the cabin glowed with warmth and purpose. For so many years after losing her husband, Emily had felt adrift, desperately searching for meaning. Now, kneading bread in this contested cabin, she felt the first stirrings of true belonging. Here was a home worth fighting for. Here were people worth standing beside, no matter what came. The dough rose slowly by the fire, while Emily stitched a loose button on Robert's spare shirt. Such a simple thing, caring for someone else's needs. Yet it filled an empty place in her heart she'd almost forgotten existed. She thought of Robert in his cold cell, of Wachiwi keeping faith through years of broken promises, of the strength that came from standing together. The railroad agent's threats seemed to fade against the reality of their shared courage. Snow whispered against the windows, but Emily barely noticed the storm. She was too busy counting blessings, the steady heat of the stove, the smell of rising bread, the knowledge that she was no longer alone. For the first time since buying the cabin, she felt truly warm. Dawn crept over the mountains in shades of pewter and slate, painting the courthouse steps with weak winter light. Emily smoothed her brown wool dress, plain but pristine, every seam perfectly straight. Her hands trembled as she pinned her mother's cameo brooch at her throat. The streets of Silverton lay hushed under a thin blanket of fresh snow. Emily's boots crunched softly as she made her way to the edge of town where Wachiwi waited. The elderly woman stood straight-backed despite the cold, her dark shawl drawn close, a small leather pouch hanging at her waist. "Creator gives us good morning," Wachiwi said, inclining her head in greeting. "He does indeed," Emily replied, though her stomach churned with nerves. "Are you ready?" "Truth is always ready," Wachiwi said simply. "It waits only to be spoken." They walked together through town, past shuttered storefronts where faces peered out and quickly withdrew. A group of men lounged outside the saloon, watching their approach with hard eyes. One spat in the snow as they passed. Emily lifted her chin higher, though her heart pounded. She felt Wachiwi's quiet strength beside her, steady as mountain stone. Together they climbed the courthouse steps, their skirts whispering against worn wood. Inside, the courtroom already buzzed with spectators. The railroad agent stood near the front, cutting a dashing figure in his tailored suit. He turned as they entered, his handsome face twisting into a sneer. "Well, well," he drawled loudly enough for all to hear. "The widow brings her pet Indian to tell tales." How touching. Hot color flooded Emily's cheeks, but Wachiwi's expression remained serene. They took their seats in the front row, ignoring the whispers that rippled through the crowd. Judge Harrison entered, his black robes sweeping behind him. Emily had seen him at church, remembered his dismissive wave when she'd tried to plead Robert's case before. Now he settled behind his desk with a stern frown, shuffling papers importantly. "This hearing concerns the disputed claim of one Emily Hensley to property lot number 47, he intoned. "The railroad company contests this claim and presents prior rights of eminent domain. Mrs. Hensley, you may present your witness." Emily stood, clasping her hands to still their shaking. "Your Honor, I call Wachiwi, widow of Gray Owl, to testify regarding the rightful building of the cabin under treaty terms." The railroad's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection." "This is absurd, Your Honor. An Indian woman's word against proper legal documents? She can't even swear on the Bible?" "I will hear the witness," Judge Harrison said firmly, surprising Emily. "Though I warn you, Mrs. Hensley, this had better be relevant." Wachiwi approached the front with dignified grace. She stood straight, her silver-streaked hair bound neatly back, her aged face etched with wisdom. "Tell us about the cabin," Emily prompted gently. "When was it built?" 15 winters past, Wachiwi began, her voice clear and strong. My husband Gray Owl and Robert Brant built it together, under the treaty that promised our people could still use those hunting grounds. They marked each log with special signs, crossed arrows for partnership, bare tracks for strength. Robert carved a token to seal their agreement, as was our custom. The railroad agent's lawyer interrupted with a harsh laugh. Fairy tales and savage superstition. Your Honor, surely we're not wasting time with— I have the token here, Wachiwi continued calmly, reaching into her leather pouch. She withdrew a smooth wooden disc, elaborately carved with interwoven symbols. The courtroom fell utterly silent. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression suddenly intent. Bring that here, he ordered. Wachiwi placed the token in his outstretched hand. The judge turned it slowly, studying the intricate patterns. His hands trembled slightly. I recognize these markings, he said quietly. My father was Indian agent here 20 years ago. He showed me tokens like this, official markers of treaty agreements between settlers and tribes. He looked up sharply. Where did you get this? My husband and Robert Brant carved it together, witnessed by our eldest ones, Wachiwi replied. It tells the story of their promise, to share the land in peace, to build shelter that would welcome both peoples. The cabin stands on ground blessed by that promise. The railroad's lawyer sputtered. Objection. These primitive trinkets have no legal standing. Overruled, Judge Harrison snapped. He was still staring at the token, running his fingers over the symbols. I remember my father saying these were as binding as any paper contract to the tribes. More binding, perhaps, since they couldn't be lost or destroyed so easily. Emily's heart leapt. She saw the railroad agent's face darken with fury. The cabin was built in good faith under treaty rights, Wachiwi continued. Robert Brant honored all promises. When soldiers came later to burn other cabins, his stayed because it was properly marked and witnessed. The railroad has no right to take what was built in trust. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison set the token down carefully, his expression troubled. This complicates matters, he said slowly. I will need time to review the treaty documents and consult records of my father's term as Indian agent. This hearing is adjourned until I reach a decision. His gavel cracked sharply. The railroad agent stormed out, his boots striking the floor like gunshots. Emily sagged slightly in relief, though she knew the battle wasn't over. Wachiwi touched her arm gently. Come, she said. We will pray together for wisdom to guide his judgment. They left the courthouse side by side, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them. Outside, they paused on the steps. Wachiwi raised her face to the pale sky and began to pray in her own language, her voice carrying quiet strength. Emily bowed her head and added her own prayers in English, their words twining together in the winter air. Snow had begun falling again by the time Emily made her way back to the cabin. The windows were dark, Robert's absence still an ache in her heart. She lit the lamp with trembling fingers, watching shadows dance across the rough-hewn walls. Each log bore the marks Wachiwi had described, crossed arrows, bear tracks, symbols of partnership and strength. How had she never noticed them before? The wind picked up as night deepened, driving snow against the glass in white swirls. Emily added wood to the stove and settled in her rocking chair with her Bible. But the words blurred before her eyes. Her mind kept returning to the courtroom, to the judge's thoughtful frown as he studied the token, to the fury on the railroad agent's face. "Please, Lord," she whispered into the lamplight, "let truth prevail. Let justice be done." Outside, the storm raged on. Emily rocked slowly, watching the window panes turn white with frost, praying and waiting for morning to come. The courthouse bell pealed through the frosty morning air, its deep tone echoing off the snow-covered mountains. Emily jerked awake in her rocking chair, realizing she had dozed off while waiting. Her neck ached from the awkward position, but she ignored the discomfort as she hastily pulled on her coat and boots. The streets were already filling with townspeople heading toward the courthouse, their breaths forming white clouds in the cold air. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she hurried along the boardwalk, her boots crunching through fresh snow. She spotted Wachui waiting near the courthouse steps, wrapped in a thick wool blanket against the chill. "You have not slept," Wachui observed, touching Emily's cheek with weathered fingers. "Not much," Emily admitted. "I kept thinking about Robert in that cold jail cell." "Soon he will be free," Wachui said with quiet certainty. "Come, we will hear the truth spoken at last." They entered the packed courtroom together, squeezing through the crowd to find seats near the front. The railroad agent stood by his lawyer's table, looking confident in a fresh suit and polished boots. Emily tried not to let his smug expression shake her faith. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Harrison entered. The room fell silent as he took his seat, arranging his papers with deliberate care. Emily held her breath, fingers pressed against the rough wooden bench beneath her. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented," the judge began, his voice filling the hushed chamber, "including review of my father's records from his time as Indian agent, I have reached my decision regarding the disputed cabin claim." He lifted Wachiwi's carved token, holding it where all could see. This marker represents a binding agreement made under treaty terms, predating any railroad survey of the land. The symbols carved here match official records of sanctioned settlements from that period. More importantly, they represent a promise made in good faith between peoples. The railroad agent shifted uneasily, his confidence beginning to crack. Judge Harrison continued, his tone growing stronger. The cabin was legally built through partnership between Robert Brant and Gray Owl, with proper witnessing and marking according to both territorial and tribal custom. As such, it stands as lawful homestead property, its claim predating any railroad right-of-way by several years. Emily's heart soared. She grabbed Wachiwi's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Therefore, I hereby declare the railroad's claim to Lot 47 null and void. The eviction notice is canceled, and ownership is confirmed to Emily Hensley through her legal deed of purchase. Furthermore..." The judge paused, fixing the railroad agent with a stern glare. "I order the immediate release of Robert Brant, as the charges against him were clearly manufactured to serve improper ends." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. The railroad agent's face twisted with fury as he spun on his heel and stormed out, his lawyer scrambling to gather papers in his wake. Emily barely noticed. She was already rushing toward the door, Wachiwi following at a more dignified pace. They hurried through the snowy street to the jail, arriving just as the sheriff was unlocking Robert's cell. Robert stepped out slowly, blinking in the bright light streaming through the window. His beard had grown shaggier during his confinement, and his clothes were rumpled, but his eyes were clear and alert. When he saw Emily, he crossed the space between them in 2 long strides. His huge hands gripped her shoulders, gentle despite their strength. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, something like wonder in his expression. "You did it," he said roughly. "You actually did it." "We did it," Emily corrected, her voice trembling. "You, me, and Wachiwi together." Robert turned to where Wachiwi stood watching them, her dark eyes warm with approval. He bowed his head to her. "I never thought to see that token again," he said. "You kept it safe all these years?" "Some promises are worth keeping," Wachiwi replied. She reached up to touch both their faces with her weathered hands. Then she spoke several melodic phrases in her native tongue. "What did she say?" Emily whispered to Robert. "She's blessing us," he translated quietly, "asking the Creator to watch over our home and keep our hearts strong together." Emily felt tears well up in her eyes. "Thank you," she told Wachiwi, "for everything." "Truth speaks itself," Wachiwi said simply. I only gave it voice." She adjusted her blanket around her shoulders. "Now I must return to my own home before the snow comes again. Be well, my friends." They watched her walk away, her straight back and dignified bearing drawing curious looks from townspeople who had gathered to hear news of the ruling. Emily noticed some faces showed shame now, others a new respect. The sheriff's wife, who had once snubbed Emily at church, offered a tentative smile as she passed. "Best be heading home ourselves," Robert said, looking at the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. "Storm's coming in fast." "Home." The word filled Emily's heart with warmth. She nodded, and they set off together toward the trail leading up to their cabin. The climb was harder than usual. Emily's sleepless night had left her legs shaky, and the new snow made the path treacherous. After she stumbled for the third time, Robert wordlessly took her carpetbag from her shoulder and added it to his own burden. "I can manage," Emily protested weakly. "Reckon you've managed plenty these past weeks," Robert replied. "Let me do this small thing." Emily fell silent, touched by the gentle gruffness in his voice. They continued upward, Robert occasionally stretching back a steadying hand to help her over icy patches. The simple gesture felt monumental, a bridge built between their separate solitudes. The first snowflakes were starting to fall as they crested the final ridge. Their cabin stood solid against the darkening sky, smoke curling from the chimney where Emily had banked the morning fire. Robert paused, studying the log walls as if seeing them anew. "Never thought to have a home again," he said quietly. "Not after the soldiers burned out the other cabins. Figured I'd just survive up here alone until the end." He glanced at Emily. "You changed that?" "God changed it," Emily corrected gently. "He led me here for a reason, though I didn't understand it at first." Robert nodded slowly. Then, to Emily's surprise, he reached out and took her hand in his large, calloused one. Together they walked the final steps to their door as snow began falling more heavily around them. Inside the cabin, Emily moved with fresh energy despite her weariness. The familiar scent of wood smoke mingled with the rich aroma of venison stew bubbling in the iron pot. She shaped bread dough with practiced hands, humming an old hymn as she worked. The simple acts of cooking felt different now, no longer tinged with uncertainty, but full of purpose and joy. Robert sat at the rough-hewn table, his large frame making the sturdy chair seem small. His eyes followed Emily's movements, but his posture remained stiff, as if he didn't quite know what to do with happiness. When Emily set out 2 bowls and spoons, the clink of metal against wood seemed unusually loud in the quiet cabin. "Reckon this calls for something special," Emily said, ladling the steaming stew. The rich gravy glistened with vegetables and tender meat. She placed a fresh-baked loaf between them, its golden crust still warm from the oven. Robert cleared his throat. "Been a spell since I had cause to celebrate." "Then we'd best do it proper," Emily replied gently. She folded her hands and bowed her head. After a moment's hesitation, Robert did the same, his weathered fingers interlacing awkwardly. "Dear Lord," Emily began, her voice soft but steady, "we thank you for your providence and protection, for justice done and home preserved, for bringing unlikely friends together in need. Bless this food to our use, and us to your service. Amen." "Amen," Robert echoed, the word rough with emotion. They ate in companionable silence for a while, savoring the good food and the peace of being home. Snow fell steadily outside the window, but inside the cabin was warm and bright with lamplight. "Got something for you?" Robert said suddenly, pushing back from the table. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small wooden object wrapped in a scrap of cloth. "Made it while I was away." Emily carefully unwrapped the bundle. In her palm lay a beautifully carved cross, small enough to fit in her hand, but intricately detailed with flowing patterns that reminded her of growing vines. The wood had been smoothed to a soft sheen. "Oh, Robert," she breathed, running her finger along the delicate work. "It's lovely." "Weren't much else to do in that cell," he said gruffly. "Got to thinking about what you said, about God leading you here. Figured maybe he had a hand in it all, somehow." Tears pricked Emily's eyes. She held the cross close to her heart, touched beyond words by the gift's deeper meaning. The next few days brought a steady stream of visitors, despite the winter weather. First came Pastor Dillard's wife, carrying a basket of preserves and a shamefaced apology for not standing with Emily sooner. Then the sheriff's wife arrived with a quilting frame, saying she'd heard Emily might need help setting up beds in the loft. Even Mrs. Henderson, who had been among the cruelest gossips, appeared at the door with a pat of fresh butter and red-rimmed eyes. "I judged wrong," she admitted. "Both of you." The children were the easiest to welcome. Word spread quickly about Robert's wooden toys, and soon small faces appeared regularly at the cabin windows. Emily would invite them in for warm bread and milk, while Robert pretended to grumble about the noise. But his hands were always busy with his whittling knife, crafting tiny horses and wagons that brought squeals of delight. One afternoon, Emily climbed to the loft, measuring and planning. She arranged the space into neat sections, visualizing where bunks could be built and trunks stored. "Ain't much room up there," Robert observed from below. "There's room enough," Emily replied. "For a start, anyway. Maybe we can add on come spring." She descended the ladder carefully. This cabin was meant to be more than just shelter for two lonely people. It can be a refuge for others who need one. Robert was quiet for a long moment, studying the wooden cross he'd carved, which now hung beside Emily's Bible on the mantel. "Used to guard this place like a bear with a den," he said finally. "Feared losing it so much I never thought about sharing it." He looked at Emily, his eyes softening. "But you showed me different." "Showed me a home ain't really a home unless it's open to those in need." Emily's heart swelled with emotion. "Then you don't mind? The visitors, the children, the plans for more?" "Mind?" Robert shook his head slowly. "No, I don't mind sharing the cabin. Or," he swallowed hard, "or sharing my life, not anymore. Not with you." The afternoon light was fading as Emily finished arranging a fresh loaf of bread on the kitchen shelf. Outside, fat snowflakes drifted past the window, settling thick and heavy on the mountain slopes. The storm they'd watched build all day had finally arrived, bringing with it the deep silence of winter. Robert stood at the door, pulling on his heavy coat. "Best check the woodpiles covered proper before this sets in." His voice had lost its defensive edge over these past weeks, softening like winter wool washed in warm water. Emily nodded, reaching for her shawl. "I'll come with you." She'd learned that even simple tasks felt lighter when shared. Together they stepped out onto the cabin's small porch. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp scent of pine and snow. Their breath formed small clouds in the gathering dusk. The woodpile, stacked high against the cabin wall, wore a thick white blanket already. Robert tugged the tarp more securely over the logs, while Emily brushed accumulated snow from the edges. Behind them, lamplight spilled from the cabin windows, casting warm rectangles of gold across the pristine white ground. The sight made Emily pause, her hands stilling on the rough canvas. "Would you look at that?" she whispered. Robert straightened, following her gaze. The cabin glowed like a lantern in the deepening blue of evening. Smoke curled from the chimney in a lazy spiral, carrying with it the scent of pine and warmth. Through the windows, they could see the familiar shapes of their shared life. The rocking chair Emily had cushioned with a new pad, the shelf of wooden toys Robert had carved, the Bible and cross on the mantel. Emily slipped her arm through Robert's, leaning slightly against his solid presence. "To think I almost let fear stop me from coming here." Her voice was soft with wonder. $1. That's all it took to change everything." Robert's arm tightened against hers. "Weren't just the dollar?" he said gruffly. "Was your faith. Your stubborn way of seeing hope where there weren't none." "God's way of seeing hope," Emily corrected gently. "He turned that $1 into priceless blessings. A home. Purpose." She looked up at Robert. Family. The snow fell more heavily now, each flake catching the golden light from the windows before settling into the growing drifts. The forest around them had gone completely silent, as if holding its breath in the gathering dark. Even the wind had stilled. Robert shifted beside her, his face thoughtful in the dim light. Then, to Emily's amazement, he bowed his head. His voice, when it came, was rough but clear. "Lord," he began hesitantly, "I ain't much for proper prayers, but I reckon you know that already." He paused, clearing his throat. "Thank you for sending Emily here when I was too stubborn to know I needed anybody. Thank you for showing us both that a home ain't meant to be a fortress. And," his voice grew softer, "thank you for second chances." "Amen," Emily whispered, her eyes bright with tears. In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountainsides, its lonely sound floating through the snow-filled air. Emily felt Robert tense slightly, but there was no fear in it now. The railroad had marked their greatest trial, but God had turned even that to blessing. Now the whistle was just another voice in the chorus of their mountain home, joining the wind in the pines and the creek's constant song. "Getting colder," Robert observed, though he made no move to go inside. "Storm's settling in proper now." Emily nodded, watching the snowflakes swirl in the lamplight. "Remember that first night? When I showed up uninvited with nothing but a carpet bag and a deed?" "Thought you were plumb crazy," Robert admitted with a low chuckle. "Standing there in your town shoes looking like a lost bird but talking brave as you please." "I was terrified," Emily confessed, "but something told me I had to stay. That God had led me here for a reason." "Reckon he did at that." Robert's voice was gentle. "Led us both home." The snow was falling faster now, transforming the familiar landscape into something soft and new. Emily shivered slightly, and Robert turned toward the door. "Best get inside before you catch your death." Hand in hand, they crossed the small porch. Robert held the door as Emily stepped through, then followed her into the warmth. The fire burned bright in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Emily moved to stir it while Robert shook the snow from his coat. The cabin that had once felt so bare now breathed with life and purpose. Children's drawings decorated one wall, gifts from their regular visitors. A half-finished quilt draped over Emily's rocking chair, intended for the first widow who would need shelter in their expanding home. Robert's newest carvings lined the mantel, waiting to bring joy to young faces. As Emily hung her shawl on its peg, she caught Robert watching her with an expression that still surprised her sometimes, one of quiet wonderment, as if he too couldn't quite believe how much had changed. She smiled at him, and his weathered face softened in return. Robert moved to close the heavy wooden door against the winter night. The latch fell with a solid thunk, sealing them in their warm sanctuary while the storm raged outside. But unlike before, when such storms had meant lonely vigils, now they brought only peace. The cabin had transformed from a hermit's hideaway into something far more precious, a haven of hope for all who might need it. Together they settled in for the evening as the snow continued to fall, adding another layer to the deep blanket that would cover their mountain home until spring brought its own renewal. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.